My name's Terry Beckwith. I grew up in a small town of Weston, Oregon, and we grew up hearing stories of the old days from my dad. And my dad was born in 1914. His name was Leslie Beckwith, and he also grew up hearing the stories from his grandfather. His grandfather was Pete Williams. Pete Williams was born in 1871. Pete's grandfather was Cape. Cape signed the treaty at Quinault. Pete's father, my dad's great-grandfather, was Jack Williams. Jack Williams was born in 1851. My dad grew up with Pete Williams and Jack Williams. Jack Williams died when my dad was 14 years old. Pete Williams was around quite a number of years after that. They grew up in, my dad grew up in Montezano, Washington, and he also grew up in Chinooks Creek. They would go back and forth depending on fishing. That's how they lived. Was Pete's grandfather signed the treaty, and so Pete was always fishing, off-reservation fishing, and he was getting arrested for it, and it was reserved fishing rights in the treaty, so he had the right to fish, and he would fish in different locations, and he was always getting arrested. And 100 years ago, there was stories in the paper 100 years ago where Pete Williams would get arrested for fishing. Then there was a time at Chinooks Creek when they took his nets and confiscated his nets and arrested him, took him in. He had a trial and he won his case. And they tried to give him his nets back, and he wouldn't take them. He told them, "No, you guys put them back where you got them." And the judge said, "Yeah, put them back where you got them." And they had to reset those nets at Chinooks Creek. They went back and forth between Montezano and Chinooks Creek. They finally lost their home in Montezano. They had lived there all the time for generations, and the settlers came in and they ended up losing 3 houses. They had 3 houses right together there. One was Jack Williams' home, and one was Pete Williams' home, and one was Ernest Beckwith's home. Ernest Beckwith was my grandfather, and my dad was 14 at the time they lost their home. And so they were looking for a place to live at that time, and they were looking at Skokomish Reservation and the Chehalis Reservation. Well, the Chehalis Reservation at that time was more for Upper Chehalis Indians, and my grandfather, Ernest Beckwith, he was Lower Chehalis, and Jack Williams was Lower Chehalis. Jack Williams was a Wainuchi Indian, and that was a Lower Chehalis tribe. Ernest Beckwith, I've just known of him as being Lower Chehalis. I thought he was Hump Tulips, but we found some information more recently where he was also a Wainuchi Indian as well. So they were, Jack Williams' mother, I believe it was Skokomish, and maybe that's why they were looking at Skokomish. Pete Williams' mother was Jane Cape, and she was Quinault. And I'm not sure if they looked at Quinault or not. Jack Williams had a sister up there, Annie Wakinas, and Pete Williams had a brother there. He had a brother named Freddie Williams. Freddie Williams died in 1950. Annie Wakinas died in 1951. But they ended up moving to the Chehalis Reservation, and ended up leaving their homes, and one time my dad and I went up to Tahola on the Quinault Reservation, and we went by their home, and it was a nice home. It was a nice big dark brown home. It had a big porch with posts out there, and I always wondered how come they left that home, that home was much better than the home they had on the Chehalis Reservation. Of course, they had a different home before, and it burnt down, but it was a nice home that they had. Two of the homes got moved, and one of them is still in place where the homesteaders ended up moving. The one home that's still there, I think it was the home that belonged to Jack Williams, but I'm not real sure. But I know one time we went and talked to Soup Corwin over at Tahola, and he told about where Jack Williams lived and where that home was. And so anyway, that home, that was my dad's great aunts. That was Pete Williams' sisters and brothers that lived there in that home. And that was Ella Williams, Ella Corwin, Eva Williams, that grew up there in that home. They were my dad's great aunts, but they were about the same age as my dad. They were Pete Williams' sisters. Pete was born in 1871, and the rest of the family was born around 1900 to 1915, 1917, something around there. So they ended up moving to the Chehalis Reservation in 1928, and our family was big into a gambling game called Slahal, or stick game, or bone game, and they got down there and they were playing that every night. It seemed like every night, maybe not all the time, but my dad was really good. And they would go on the weekends, they would go up to Adoma Park, and that was, they would jump in the car and head off to Adoma Park, and more than one car, and my dad was really good. But Adoma Park was outside of Puyallup. It was a few miles east of the Puyallup Reservation, the town of Puyallup actually. And Adoma Park, it was owned, I guess, by a guy named, I think his name was Applegate. I think that's what Dad said. And he had it all fixed up there. He had lighted booths and had a dance floor, an outdoor dance floor where people would dance, and they would have a place for Slahal. And my dad was really good at that, and he would play against these British Columbia Indians, and they always accused him of cheating. And anyway, they would go there on the weekends. One time they were going there, and Dad told about these guys were going much faster than them, and one guy stuck his head out of the car and was signaling for them to come on because they were going so slow. But Dad knew the shortcut, and he took this shortcut and ended up there at Adoma Park before those other guys got up there. They were really laughing about that. Pete Williams, he lived the old way. He had quite a number of wives, and my grandmother, her name was Lizzie Williams Beckwith. She married Ernest Beckwith. She died in the late 30s, and Ernest Beckwith was born in 1886, May of 1886, and she was a little bit younger than Ernest Beckwith. Her mom was Maggie Solix, or Maggie Chanus, and Maggie was born way back in the 1800s. Maggie died when my dad was 8 years old, about 1922. I don't think she was around very much. Dad never talked much about Maggie. He always referred to her as Maggie Chanus, but he never never talked a whole lot about her. And Pete Williams' other wives, he never talked much about them either, except for Kate Williams. Kate Williams was Yakima. She was married to Caesar Williams. He was one of the Columbia River chiefs. And Kate Williams was born on the, I think she grew up on the Oregon side of the Columbia River. And so she was probably born in the 1870s, I suppose, also. But Caesar Williams died, and so Kate Williams ended up marrying Pete Williams. And that's who my dad really considered his grandmother. And they would go over to Yakima. Dad would talk about going over with Pete Williams, and Dad had, there were 11 of them in my dad's family, 11 kids. Dad was the oldest boy. The oldest one was Gladys Brown. She was born in 1912. Dad was born in 1914. But Pete would take Dad over to Yakima, and they would go over there and they would stay at either at Coyotes Jim's house, or they would stay at somebody's house where Coyotes Jim was. I know he used to talk about Coyotes Jim. He pronounced his name a little different than that. But they would go over there, and Pete and Kate, they were living over there in Yakima. And one time they got ready to go down to the Columbia River, and they couldn't find their dog anywhere, and they tried calling their dog, and the dog just didn't show up. So finally they went down to the Oregon side of the Columbia River, and they'd been down there for some time, and here came that dog walking up there. They never did know how that dog got down there, but the dog, and I don't know if that was a regular place that they would go. That was where she grew up, so maybe they did, and maybe the dog was familiar with the place. But that was a long ways that they went from Yakima down there to the Oregon side of the Columbia River. The Columbia River wasn't like it is today. It was a wild river. There were no dams along the river. She was still alive after Pete died. Pete died around, I think Pete died maybe around 1938. He died in the Shaker Church on the Chehalis Reservation. But Kate Williams was still alive for some years after that. Lizzie Williams died, I think, the following year in 1939. One time, my mom's name's Isla Beckwith. She was white. My mom was telling about the time they went to a funeral. And when they left the funeral, Lizzie Williams was telling Mom that I'm not going to be around much longer either. I have the same as what this lady that had just died, I don't know who it was, but that she had the same, and she said that I'm probably not going to be around long. And Mom didn't think she was sick or anything at the time, but it wasn't too long and she died. Anyway, my folks had trust property over in Wallowa County, Oregon. And what had happened there was everything that Indians would do, the BI was totally in control of their lives. And I know when I grew up, people would say BI stood for Boss Indians Around, and it was really bad when Dad was growing up. My dad had he had money from a timber sale in his IIM account, Individual Indian Money account, but he couldn't get it unless he would go to the BI superintendent. And the BI superintendent was a guy named W.B. Sams, and Dad didn't have much use for W.B. Sams. One time I was in the National Archives back in 1980, I guess, 79 and 80, but in 1980 I saw these files along the wall in the National Archives. You can't get back there today, but there's these cards there on individual Indians. And in that last hour that I was there, I'd been there for about a week looking for railroads for Oklahoma, and I just happened to look at the card file, and I just thought, I wonder if there's any Beckwith in there. And I found, I believe, 11 files on my dad in the National Archives, Leslie Beckwith. And there was one that was on a sewing machine, a washing machine. He had to ask the BIA for money out of his own account to get a washing machine. There was one on an old car. It was seems like a 1937 Plymouth or something like that, and he wanted to get that Plymouth, and W.B. Sams told him, no, I'm not going to approve that for you. But if you go down to my brother's, I think it was a Chevrolet dealership, I'll approve that. My dad said, no, I'm not going to do that. Didn't tell W.B. Sams that, but he decided what he was going to do. The government wanted Indians to be farmers, and he thought, well, if they want me to be a farmer or rancher, I'll just find some property and I'll buy the property, and they'll have to approve it, of course, and then I'll buy cattle. They'll have to approve that, and then I'll sell my land and my cattle. So he went a long, long ways from the reservation, Quinault Reservation, and he found this land, and it was in Wallowa County, Oregon. I think it was 28 miles off the highway, and it was a half section of land, 320 acres. So anyway, he went back and told the folks at the BIA office about it, and they sent a couple of guys out there to take a look at the property, and yeah, it looked okay, so they bought the land for him. Quinault was considered an IRA tribe, so Dad couldn't sell his property. He did ranch there for a while. He'd never ranched before, but he had cattle, and he ranched, and he trapped, and they lived way out there. And he talked about the time when his brother Calvin Beckwith was playing in the state basketball tournament for Oakville High School, Oakville, Washington. And that was when there was a state tournament, for just one state tournament for all the schools, no matter how big or how small the school. Oakville was a very small school. And they were playing in the tournament, and my folks were living out in Wallowa County, Oregon. And he got this battery out of the car, and he would go up, and they would go up to this rock, and they would take this battery and they hooked a radio to it, and they could hear the state tournament going on. I think it was in Tacoma, but anyway, it was fading in and out. I think Oakville lost I think Oakville won in the finals to, seems like Lincoln High School of Tacoma, but it was Calvin he was an outstanding athlete, Calvin Beckwith. I think he got some kind of an award, like most popular player or something like that.